Hello again. So in this video, we're going to talk about photography basics. So I've got my camera. Now, how do I use it? The first thing that you're going to want to look at is what's called the exposure triangle. That's this thing right here. So what this means is that there's really three things that go into getting your picture exposed correctly. At the end of the day, it all comes down to how much light or how little light you're letting into your camera. Those three things are, number one, your aperture, number two, your shutter speed, number three, your ISO, aka your film speed. So let's break those down a little bit. The first thing is your aperture. This is how big the opening on your lens is. In other words, how much light am I letting into my camera? With a lower aperture of, say, 5.6 or 2.8, that's a really, really wide opening. It's probably something that looks sort of like this. You're letting in a lot of light into your camera. Now, with a smaller aperture, a higher aperture with, say, f18 or f20, that's a much smaller opening. So you're letting in much less light. The second part you'll need to know is your shutter speed. This is how long that opening is open for. So a shutter speed of, say, 1/500 or 1/500th of a second, that's really fast. Versus a shutter speed of 120 or 1/20th of a second is very, very slow. Finally, the third part is your ISO. This is the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. Now, back in the film days, this was your film speed. Now, think of it this way. Higher ISO means your camera's sensor is more sensitive to light, which means you can shoot in lower light. So on a lower ISO, say ISO 100, you've got lots of light. It's daylight. Versus a higher ISO, say ISO 1600, generally you're going to want to use something like that in the evenings or at night when there's less light. So really understand the relationship between all three. In other words, when you change one, what happens to the other two? This is the exposure triangle. All right, so the second thing that you're going to want to pay attention to is your file format. Remember how we talk about RAW versus JPEG? That's right now. Most photographers, including myself, only ever shoot in RAW. Why? Here's a great example. This picture was shot in RAW. This picture was shot in JPEG. RAW is pure uncompressed camera data. With a JPEG, your camera is taking the picture and then compressing the data, oftentimes before you even see the picture on your computer screen. We only want to be doing that at the very end, after we've done all of our edits. So, in other words, unlike Gordon Ramsay, we want things to be raw. The third thing you'll want to adjust is your camera meter. This is the way that your camera calculates the light in the scene. We'll get more into the specifics of metering and metering modes later, but in general, I like to use evaluative meter on Canon. And on Nikon, I think that's spot, but I don't feel like that's exactly right. So again, please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't shoot Nikon. So finally, you're going to want to set your focus mode. For moving aircraft, you're generally going to want to be in AI servo mode on Canon, and this is also called AFC on Nikon. This will allow the camera to focus on a moving subject and keep that subject in focus as it moves through the frame. And we'll get more in depth on focus and focus points in a later video, but again, just know for now, you're going to want to be in AI servo mode. So to sum up, you're going to want to pay attention to four things when taking your pictures. One is the exposure triangle. Two, you're going to want to shoot in RAW. Three, your meter mode. Remember to use evaluative. And finally, AI servo focus mode. Okay, great, but what mode do I want my camera to be in? What settings do I want? Generally, for moving airplanes, you're going to be shooting in two modes. The first mode is aperture priority. This is AV on Canon and A on Nikon if you're shooting jets. Generally, the faster the jet is moving, the wider the aperture you'll want, and which will by default make your shutter speed faster so you can freeze the action. Remember, with jets, speed is your friend. On a bright sunny day, you're generally going to want to be around anywhere from maybe f8 to about maybe f12-ish, maybe kind of in there. The second mode that you'll be shooting in is shutter priority. This is TV on Canon and S on Nikon if you're shooting propeller planes or helicopters. Unlike jets, speed is not your friend. If you want to blur out the props and get what's called prop blur, your shutter speed needs to be no higher than 1/200th of a second. Any faster and you'll freeze the props. You don't want that. You want the props to blur out, which gives the illusion of motion. So in other words, when you're doing props, you want it to look like this, not this. Generally, you're going to want to stay away from shooting in full manual. It's just really not the best if you're trying to shoot, especially if you're trying to shoot moving subjects. It doesn't, don't do it. Oh, and also, please stay out of full auto mode, please. And we'll get more into the exact camera settings for aviation in the next video, so please stay tuned.